A very, very warm welcome to you all. We have a large number of people who've registered today. I think more will be joining us. And it's great to see you all here, not least because it's about Libya, a subject that I think is all too frequently undercovered. So I'm very glad to see the interest. And without further ado, I'm going to be handing over to our chair for the day, Peter Millett, the former British ambassador to Libya, and he will guide us through. A very huge thank you to all our speakers for joining us today. I think it's a really terrific expert panel, and I'm really looking forward to their insights and explaining exactly what will happen in Libya in the coming months. All over to you, Peter. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you much, Chris, and thank you to Caabu for organizing this event. We've got three excellent speakers. So without any further ado, we'll ask each of them to do a short sort of 10-minute introduction, a little bit looking back at the last 10 years, but also I'm sure people will be interested in their views on what they expect to happen, actually with a focus on CERT right now on the HOR session there. So we'll start with Hala Bugaighis, the founder of the Jusos Center for Studies and Development. And Hala is going to look at the internal political dynamic, particularly looking back over 10 years, but the possibility of a new government of national unity and elections later this year. So over to you, Hala.
Thank you so much, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone from Tripoli. Well, I will not really focus on the last 10 years because I think what's going on at the moment is quite vital. I think at the moment the new government appointed through the peace process is going through a tough test with the cabinet formation. As some of you may know, the PM designate adopted a strategy to share the government position with different groups. So the tribal, militias, political actors, and so on. He did that to gain loyalties and avoid any disruption to the vote of confidence. This is the reason why we have a large cabinet appointed for a period does not exceed really 9 months. I know that many argue that the sharing the power or influence is inevitable following a conflict. It's really important to pave the road for more political and security stability. But still, I think at least from what we see today and yesterday, this form of settlement and negotiation often means compromising the national best interest to gain these spoilers' loyalty. I think this had a direct impact on vulnerable groups and also on groups who were not really involved directly in the conflict. From yesterday and today's session, we saw that many of these, it really backlashed, yes. So many of these groups were basically putting pressure on the government and suggest different scenario to serve their own group interests. So I think all of this is really backlashing and having a negative impact on what's intended to be a trust building phase and a reconciliation process. And yes, I think this is not going very well with the scenario that or the strategy that the PM designate is adopting. And one last point on this topic, I think I personally strongly understand why they are adopting this strategy, but yet I have a concern that this scenario will emerge from just sharing the political positions to extend to influence the government programs. And to be more clear, I mean, I fear that each actor will start, these spoilers actor will start to demand a sharing and development projects that the government is promising everyone, and the government contracts or appointment in embassy and so on and so forth. So I just want, because the question is about the election and whether would it be an election in December or not. I mean, this new executive authority, the Presidential Council and the government was really appointed for the main purpose of completing the election process and to take the country to the national election. But this is not an easy task. Mainly, I want to stress out that we have a general agreement among many actors and also the people supporting this, that the referendum on the constitutional draft should be held before the December election. Many argue that this will, I mean, we need to end all transitional phases that we had and all these government bodies that we have. But according to the election committee or commission, the referendum will not be possible before a period of 6 months. And even though if we have this, according to public polls and researchers, the vote will likely declare unwillingness to proceed with these with the current draft, which means that it will return to the Constitutional Commission. They will work on the amendments, and then they will proceed with a second round of referendum. This, of course, will eat into the frame time and the financial resources. Now there is more, and in today's session, there was a talk about proceed with the delay the referendum on the constitution and proceed with the election. And but this still, I mean, and I don't really want to get into deep, but it has so many challenges. Yes, giving it the lack of trust of the democratic process in Libya, the logistic issues, and also that we really need a law. And to prepare a law and to submit it to the HR, get approval, this is all, it's a challenge given the tight time framework. So last, I think, a very important thing, last week, the head of the State Council stated that the GNU may prolong for 2 years to hold the national election. It was a statement by Khalid al-Mishri. In today's session, this echoed in few statements by the HOR members and also by the PM designate. This was in spite of Mr. Daiba confirming time and time again they would fulfill their commitment to having the election in December. I mean, take these movement in consideration and all the challenges I just stated above. I think there is a high likelihood that we will not have the election by the end of the year. And just, somehow to conclude in positive attitude, I strongly think that the government should focus on areas defined on the roadmap prepared by UNSMIL, like the election, public services, and economic recovery measures. And I really need to stress this. I would advise the government and anyone advising them that they need to work that with minimum spending and transparent public procurement process, because I believe that this will help to counteract any blackmailing that's going on at the moment from the different spoiler on the ground. And on this note, I will like to stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hala. Could I just, before we move on to Emad, do you think the elections in December should be presidential and parliamentary, or simply parliamentary, given that there is no law for presidential elections?
I personally think, and I know that this is reflected to many Libyan opinion, we really need a parliamentary election, because we really need to end this mess between the State Council and the HOR that's going on. Even the PM designate today mentioned that he is torn between both of them. And I think this should be the priority at the moment. Okay.
Thank you very much, Hala. So we'll go to Emadeddin Badi, who is a researcher and consultant specializing in European foreign policies towards Libya. And Emad is going to talk to us about the military security dynamic, both the creation of the militias over the last 10 years and the prospect of the ceasefire and security sector reform and DDR. Over to you, Emad.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's a huge endeavor, so I'll try to be very quick about it. And so basically, just to reflect kind of on the past 10 years, so to speak, you can argue that for the irony is that despite all the violence that was unleashed as part of the kind of revolution that we had, we technically didn't do much beyond that, in that we've kept really the institutional architecture of the Gaddafi system, his economic kind of landscape. We inherited his zero-sum approach to view and conduct politics. Essentially, most of the contours of his Jamahiriya were preserved, except for the fact that his monopoly on violence had effectively disintegrated, and in most cases devolved to local levels. This paradox, to an extent, brought about the emergence of different various hybrid forms of security governance across the country back in 2011, which have morphed over time. You had local architectures and arrangements for security at the local level in 2011, some of which proved sustainable, really, actually, and some didn't and collapsed. In the process, from a security sector reform perspective and a DDR perspective as well, you could argue that artificial attempts at introducing those exacerbated certain patterns of hybrid security arrangement or hybridity at large, and often planted the seeds of conflict that erupted post-revolution. But overall, I mean, if you look at it in the past 10 years, since Libya isn't an island really, keeping the institutional, why I mentioned this institutional economic system, keeping that system in and of itself and hoping that by establishing patronage networks and folding those armed groups under the state would restore the monopoly on violence, that proved to be an unsustainable and really dysfunctional arrangement. On the one hand, you had an ideological battle over the governance blueprint between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces worldwide, not just within the country. And that was, from my perspective, conducive really to the emergence of a foreign-sponsored, authoritarian-leaning, familial-based security architecture, which was really something which was familiar because that's the way it operated under Gaddafi. And that was embodied by Haftar post-2014. I don't think that if we I do think that if we don't address the institutional economic side of things, even if Haftar is sidelined, we'll have a reemergence of that type of blueprint purely because the economic system and the institutional landscape, the way it is set up, it is conducive to something like that being established. So unless we do reforms on that front, we'll be falling in the same trap again. And that's what brings me to the current reality and the contemporary kind of government of national unity and the conundrum that Hala spoke about. We're seeing, at the moment, it's difficult to speak really of a security sector reform process. There is this 5+5 track, and the announcement of this, the launch of this track really paved the way for the launch of the political and economic processes back in November, I believe. But this track has been approached in a silo, and since then it hasn't made much progress. And part of the reason why it hasn't made much progress is its compartmentalization. On the one hand, it's compartmentalized from the political and economic track. On the other hand, it hasn't really focused on addressing the fact that the war has now become a globalized war. It's no longer purely Libyan. It's no longer something that can be resolved exclusively through a Libyan-based solution. And you can argue that the launch of this track was partly for expediency, in that it's easier to put the blame on Libyans afterwards if it collapses. But if the past couple of years war is indicative of anything, it's the fact that foreigners have partly led or have been responsible for the protraction of the war as such. If you want to pinpoint where that happened, it's possibly with the loss of Haftar's forward base of Gherian in June of 2019. From a military perspective, had the war been exclusively domestic, that would have been conducive to a stalemate and you would have had military negotiations. But Russians swooped in, Turks swooped in, and we had another year of war, and then a Turkish and Russian brokered end of war. So now reverting back to Libyans to broker a solution is a bit of a deflection from what the root causes of the conflict were. And the viewing this kind of security sector reform or progress on the security side of things as a byproduct of a peace deal is proving to be a very blinkered view, because you're clearly seeing right now that, for instance, even despite the fact that this session is supposed to be held in Sirte, there was a clear issue in that foreign mercenaries were still there, basically, and that almost collapsed the entire political side of the equation. And had MPs not been opportunistic, to an extent, you could argue, because their meeting right now instead is more about opportunism than it is about a genuine attempt to actually bringing the country together. Had they genuinely, were these tracks linked to an extent, then you would have seen clearly that the process in its entirety would have been stalled. So overall, if in the economic overhaul right now isn't accompanied by security sector reform program, we're likely going to see in the upcoming period, and we're already seeing to an extent, that armed groups will likely reconfigure themselves and readapt or reinvent themselves in a way where they can, to a degree, continue what they've been doing in the past 5 to 10 years, particularly the past 5 years where the arrangements proved particularly unsustainable. I can mention a few examples just very quickly on the eastern and western side and the southern side of what armed groups are doing and what is happening from a security standpoint now that we have a kind of more macro view of things. In Western Libya, particularly in Tripoli, you have now most of the armed groups in Tripoli that have effectively been folded or have found the new apparatuses under the Presidential Council. So they're effectively no longer under the Ministry of Interior. So even the question of whether Bashara would remain at the helm of the Ministry of Interior or not is almost irrelevant in the Tripoli context, because most of the armed groups in the Tripoli right now are no longer under his authority anyway. So that's one thing. In Eastern Libya, Haftar has suffered to a degree from the aftermath of his war from a legitimacy perspective, but you could argue that this new list that sidelined Ghayla Saleh, his political kind of counterpart, is a boon for him in that it gives him time to scramble once again, get foreign support, put himself back on his feet, garner social legitimacy locally, and in a way, if he is sidelined, it'll probably be by foreigners that are now more entrenched in Eastern Libya, particularly the Russians, that perhaps would want to move beyond him just as part of legacy planning. Southern Libya has been completely sidelined from these discussions. There is tokenistic kind of inclusion at the level of ministerial portfolios, but the pattern we've seen in the past 10 years is that once a Southerner is appointed, he really usually technically neglects those constituencies. So I don't see the GNU particularly, if it is approved, that is, particularly investing in security on the southern border, on the south writ large. So we are likely to see, depending on what the political arrangements look like, armed groups defecting or siding with the institutions or the kind of political entity that they would benefit from siding with. That's at the moment has been the LAF for the past 2 years, you could argue, but that could change very quickly if the patronage networks cannot be sustained. Overall, in terms of the ceasefire and its sustainability, I do think that at the moment it's more sustained by the perception that the cost of relaunching war is perceived as too high. There is hopes that this government will accommodate the very foreigners that have driven the war for the past 2 years, but that could prove very blinkered view again, in that it's expected that this government will both accommodate all of the local factions, all of the foreign interveners. So that's a huge endeavor, something which even Gaddafi couldn't do. And I do think that the next 3 months are likely going to be critical in terms of seeing whether this arrangement will be semi-sustainable. And even if it is at cross purposes of the goal of having elections in December, because if the system proves to be somewhat sustainable, then no one will want to disrupt it, neither domestically nor internationally. So ultimately, it's the Libyan people that lose out on actually restoring their country's legitimacy. I'll leave it at that. Maybe we can discuss more things afterwards. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Emad. That was very good, very comprehensive. We'll move on to Mary. Mary is a researcher specializing in Libya, and Mary is going to focus on the international dynamic, the role of the international community in supporting Libya coming together. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you very much, Peter. I would say either supporting Libya and coming together or helping Libya fall further apart. I think it's useful in terms of my remarks to think of two important dates here. April 2019, which was when Khalifa Haftar launched his failed offensive to capture the capital Tripoli from the internationally recognized government of national accord, and then June of 2020, when Haftar was pushed back from the outskirts of Tripoli, and essentially it was the end of his offensive. Because when we talk about particularly foreign meddling in Libya, in the years leading up to April 2019, we had Haftar's sponsors and backers, chief amongst them Egypt and the UAE, being the most egregious violators of the UN arms embargo that's been in place in Libya since 2011. Haftar also received up to that point diplomatic support from France, all of which helped to empower him as a spoiler in the then UN process. Fast forward on to late 2019, that recognized GNA in Tripoli, which is under siege from Haftar, requests assistance from Turkey. Turkey is only too willing to give that military assistance. All kinds of agreements are signed. And it is that Turkish support for the government in Tripoli that helps push Haftar's offensive back from Tripoli. So in many respects, come June 2020, you had a situation where the Libyan factions and their external sponsors, there was a recognition that actually neither side could prevail militarily. That was a more important realization, I think, on Haftar's side, given that, the narrative Haftar had cultivated amongst himself, that he could be a future leader of Libya, that he was all powerful, that collapsed as a result of his failed offensive. And that caused his sponsors and backers to reassess their strategy in terms of backing him, and basically reassess this view that many of them had, that Haftar was essentially the solution to stabilization in Libya. Of course, there were new realities post-June 2020. Turkey became a key actor on the ground in Libya. Turkish military personnel, as well as Syrian mercenaries that Ankara funneled into Libya, remain on the ground at present. And then, of course, you had, as Imad referred to, the Russians as well, the Russian mercenaries in eastern Libya, embedded around critical energy infrastructure, embedded in the Jufra air base, a critical asset of Haftar's. So you had a situation post-June 2020 where really Turkey and Russia were the key power brokers, foreign power brokers in Libya. And since then, there has been a concern, a fear that there might be some kind of Turkish-Russian process that might emerge that could challenge or undermine the UN dialogue process. Now, that hasn't happened. And since October last year, when a ceasefire was agreed, we've seen the UN process gain a momentum that led to the political dialogue forum that Hala mentioned, and now the fact that the House of Representatives is mulling whether it's going to approve the proposed government that's emerging from that process. So the question now is whether the external backers of the different Libyan factions, what they will do now, how they are assessing the current situation. What we've seen is a notable, everybody's saying the right things. Everybody's being positive about at least publicly, about the UN process and this possible new government. And it's clear that the external power brokers are watching, waiting to see whether this incoming dispensation will serve their interests, protect their interests. So I think we're in this interesting moment right now where they're watching and waiting. No one's going to make a move in the next weeks, I think, while we're seeing this new government trying to come together. It's what happens after that. And the question of whether this incoming government will be allowed the breathing space to establish itself and also deliver on its admittedly short mandate of 9 months leading up to elections. So I think a lot of questions there. And one aspect of this also is the fact that over several years, we've seen many foreign states paying lip service to various dialogue processes and lip service to different processes inside Libya while doing something very different on the ground. So I think another concern is, particularly given what we see happening on the ground, the fact that the deadline for departure of the foreign mercenaries on all sides, Haftar with the Russians, Sudanese, Chadians, he also has Syrian mercenaries on his side, and then the Syrian mercenaries on the side of the Tripoli government. They were all supposed to leave in January. That deadline passed with little evidence that many of them had actually left. So again, the question of what is happening on the ground, what kind of calculations are going on in terms of if we're left with a situation where key meddlers in Libya feel that the incoming government doesn't suit their interests, what are they willing to do? What are they capable of doing? And one of the concerning developments in recent months has been the construction of a fortified trench extending for several dozen kilometers between Sirte and Jufra, two very strategic towns, Jufra, of course, being home to a critical airbase under Haftar's control. So there are things happening on the ground that should give some pause for thought and concern in terms of the calculations that are ongoing amongst the key foreign actors. Now, two positive signs, I think, because there are some. The US role here, the new dispensation in Washington, we no longer have an administration in Washington headed by somebody who's enthralled to the strongman paradigm, who was particularly close to Haftar's backers in Egypt and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Somebody who spoke directly to Haftar during his offensive on Tripoli. You know, that's no longer the case. What we have with the Biden administration is an administration that has made quite clear already in terms of the UAE and Egypt, how it's going to, if you like, oversee the relationship with Abu Dhabi and Cairo, but also an administration that I think, interestingly, is threaded through with key figures who either previously worked on the Libya file during the Obama administration or have followed it closely. So we have people in the administration in Washington who actually know about Libya, are informed about Libya, and in many cases care about Libya. That was not the case under the Trump administration. In the New York Times today, there's a very strong editorial urging Washington to seize the opportunity in Libya right now and basically give that heft that the process at this juncture needs. The other positive sign is the fact that a number of months ago, we saw the Gulf crisis essentially resolved. The blockade on Qatar was lifted. And since then, we see interesting noises, interesting developments between countries that are key in terms of the Libyan dynamic that have been at odds with each other. Just the other day, Ibrahim Kalin, Erdogan's spokesperson, was talking about Turkey opening a new chapter with Gulf states, a new relationship with Cairo. All of that, even if it is just kind of mood music for now, will likely have an impact on Libya, because if countries that were previously at odds with each other regionally are now warming relations, that can only have a positive impact on the internal dynamic, given that the Libyan conflict was one of the conflicts that was affected by the Gulf crisis over several years. So to finish, I think there are grounds for concern in terms of, you know, meddlers we know, and we've known for many years when it comes to the Libya file, but the fact that the Libyan realities have themselves changed. It's a different landscape with different dynamics playing outside Libya that will impact on the internal Libyan dynamic.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mary. Three really thought-provoking introductory comments there. Please, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to group the first three questions I've got and pitch them straight at Hala. So Hala, the first question is actually about the monarchy, whether there's a role for the monarchy or for the Crown Prince, Mohammed al-Sanusi, whether there's any role for the Sanusis in the future of Libya. The second part of that question is about Saif al-Islam. It's from a different person, Karen Dabrowska. Is there a role for Saif al-Islam in bringing Libyan politicians together? And I'll add also a question, which I think you can deal with probably quite quickly. Has Libya become more religious since the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime? And what is the state of Muslim, Christian, Jewish communities in Libya? I'm particularly interested there, particularly the role, I think what you could pick up there, Hala, or maybe Emad would like to comment, is on the role of the Salafists as part of that question. But there's three quite big themes there, and I'll ask Hala to tackle them, but also if Mary or Emad have comments after Hala has spoken, please go ahead. Hala.
Yes. So first, with regard to the monarchy, I think there is, with time, there is more and more demands that we at least should adopt the constitution from the monarchy times. In principle, I think they should have a role, especially in the reconciliation process. I always think that we should have a whole process of reconciliation that the monarchy and the people who were involved there should be part of it. But in politics, I mean, it's very difficult for me because I'm a very progressive person, so I don't really see that we should bring back personally. But I think there is a talk, and I think it should be considered if Libyans wants to have, monarchy back, or they want to have more of a political stability, because that's what monarchy brought up in the whole region, right? So I think it should be considered. Why not? It's the same applies to Saif al-Islam. So many people think that if Saif al-Islam is elected or part of the election, and there was a public opinion poll that many people said that they would vote to Saif al-Islam. So it's not only an assumption; it's that actually people really want him back, and I think it's part of the nostalgic to the stability that Libyans remember from the previous regime times. And I think again, if he has no charges on him and he's willing. I think that he should go to the election, and if people elected him, that we will have to deal with that. And I don't think that, honestly speaking, I don't think neither the Crown Prince nor Saif can really bring the stability to Libya. It's much more complicated than one man who can bring all solutions. It's you can see that, now from the attempts that we have now. So I think stability will not really be brought back by only having Saif or having the Crown Prince. With regard to the Salafist, I am not really expert on this topic, but as a Libyan who I lived all my life in Libya, so I think, having some sort of religion, I don't know how to say it. The people became more and more religious in the 90s. Yes, before that we were like Egypt, more or less. Yes. With the current conflict and having new radical groups, and again, I'm not an expert here, I'm just saying my observation as a normal Libyan. I think we have more and more radical groups inside Libya. I think we see many increase of the Salafist. We have Salafist schools, we have mosques that are directed by them, but that's it at the moment. So, and we see them also in politics a lot. With regard to the Jew and Christian, I don't think, at least as far as I know, sadly, we don't have any Jews in Libya at the moment. But with the Christian, and we do have churches, and I think most of the, Christian people who live here, they go there in Christmas and everything. So there is nothing, there is no attacks on these, holy places or so on and so forth. So just, to leave.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hala. Okay, Emad, would you like to pick up the point about Salafist and the role of Salafist groups?
Yeah, I'll tackle it from a security perspective. Mary will probably want to pitch in on the political side of things. My perception of most of the armed groups at this stage is that they should be treated as political actors, so to speak, because a lot of them maneuver politically, including the Salafists. Despite the fact, for all this talk about the kind of religious principles underpinning their behavior, etc. They have proven to be, at times, or most of the time, quite pragmatic players. If anything, the Salafists have proven to be the most pragmatic, and that a lot of their maneuvering has transcended the traditional divide, so to speak, and that's what makes them both most pragmatic players, but at the same time, that's what makes them, from a religious standpoint, especially since their religious beliefs kind of contradict the Libyan traditional social mores, the most problematic actors to deal with. And that, from a security perspective, is very difficult to exert kind of meaningful oversight over them. You can clearly see that even in the public kind of public displays of how they're including in the security side of things, and that a lot of the kind of security actors would, even in their wear the military uniform, whereas the military commanders affiliated with traditionally Salafist units, so to speak, refuse to do that to a degree. And they operate largely independently. Their mobilization is organized independently, even when they mobilize. I mean, some of the armed groups in Tripoli that are Salafist, or the most prominent amongst them being the Special Deterrence Force, only mobilized against Haftar's offensive after 3 months of the offensive starting. So clearly you can see that there's a discrepancy between them and the other actors that mobilize based on communal, social, economic factors, whereas these have deliberations that are entirely independent, and some of them, even from a security standpoint, operationalize a shura type decision-making structure within the apparatus itself. So they're an idiosyncratic actor, so to speak, but an actor nonetheless. They should be acknowledged, and they should be treated as the actor that they are, given the space that they operate in. I will, however, point out that it is going to be a growing issue, because they're one of the only actors that is actually investing in indoctrination, so to speak. I mean, for all the talk about IS, etc., IS has a limited footprint in Libya. Salafists have a wider footprint. They exert security on a far more localized level, and they have infiltrated endowments authority across the conflict's divide. So they've have a lot of control over mosques, etc. And it's not like the political side of things or the social side of things is completely insulated from the security side of things either. So a lot of those indoctrinated in mosques, etc., are likely to then dabble in those spaces and become part of those armed actors, so to speak. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to group another 3 questions together for Mary. The first is from Chris Doyle. Can European powers, France, Germany, Italy, succeed in agreeing a common policy approach on Libya? There was a question from Peter Tesh asking for your assessment of the impact of the current situation in Libya on the Sahel. And then there's a question from Nabila Al-Mullah about how effective is the UN presence and the EU, and who do you think are the countries that would be prone to spoil the process, internal and external? It's quite a difficult one, that last one. But if you could try and cover the other points, Mary.
Sure, thank you, Peter. Well, on the question of Europe's approach to Libya, there has been, it's fair to say, a lot of frustration in Europe in recent years over France's support for Khalifa Haftar, diplomatically in particular, in terms of enabling Haftar as it was perceived, and also undermining a common European position in terms of censoring Haftar at different points, including when he launched his April 2019 offensive. It was clear at that point that Paris was not very eager, let's just say, to censor Haftar. So the fact that, going back to what I said earlier, that not only did Haftar's Tripoli offensive fail, but his narrative has collapsed to such a degree. It's very difficult to sell Haftar now as the solution in Libya, to sell him as the prospective strongman, because the evidence obviously points otherwise. So I think there's a hope now that we will see something closer to a common European approach to Libya, because there is, generally support for the UN process, the new government that may emerge from that process. And we don't have, again, Haftar is another figure that people are watching and waiting to see how he will respond to this new government. Up to now, like others, he's been saying all the right things. He's been meeting with some people in the new executive. But again, it all depends on how he may react, or his backers may react to, you know, a broader government that they may fear doesn't exactly suit their interests or protect their interests. That is the key question right now. And it's very difficult, I think, to predict what internal or external spoilers may do at this point until we see what this new government might look like, whether it gets approved either by the HOR or the political dialogue forum to which it will go if it doesn't get approval at the House of Representatives. So there are a lot of questions right now. When the dust settles, I think we will have more clarity in terms of how the various internal and external spoilers up to this point may respond. On the Sahel, as we've seen over the last 10 years, what happens in Libya doesn't stay in Libya. Libya has infected several of the surrounding countries. It's the effects, the consequences of the fall of Gaddafi in 2011 were felt in the Sahel, as we know, in terms of the transfer of weapons and destabilization in several countries in that region. Obviously, a more stable Libya is key to addressing some of those issues that are now 10 years old. So if we see a government that is able to impose some authority in the next 9 months, but then after that, should elections happen, and as Hala mentioned earlier, there are some questions over whether that might actually be the case in December. But a stable Libya means a more stable region, essentially.
Excellent, thank you. So 3 more questions, again, starting with Hala here. A couple of short ones. Is the law which excluded Gaddafi officials, is it still on the statute books? Is it still in place? Secondly, how can the minority communities, Amazigh, Tebu, Tuareg, be accommodated within any new political framework? And I think the third one, which is quite a big economic question for you, is what would you like to see happening in terms of economic diversification? In other words, moving away from dependence on hydrocarbons towards new forms of employment. That's a big one. Try and tackle the first 2 quickly, and then see what you can give us on the economy.
The first law is still in place, but I think it will be, I mean, it will be annulled soon. It's, we see many people who worked with Gaddafi are already in, or in the previous regime are already in position. So it's not really, it's not enforced anymore, at least practically. We come to the and I'm half Amazigh, so this is very important question for me. I think the government somehow they tried to have a representation of the minority in the government, but I think there should be. They should have also the minority should have strong political presence. They should have more lobbies. They should. They already have to do more. Their presence is not enough. Unfortunately, even in the LPDF, all of the Amazigh who and the minorities, so Tebu and Tuareg, who were present there, they were not ones who were living in that area or who are advocating for the rights of the indigenous people, right? Or for different minorities. It's like when you bring a woman in the table and she is not a feminist. It's the same. So that's why you don't see. That's why you don't see. Their rights is not echoed in any of the roadmaps and so on and so forth. So I think they need to regroup and they need to work together and to push for more political inclusion for them. With regard to the economic diversification, I think the first step that we really need to do, especially in this time, is that we should have a plan, and we should have a realistic plan. Yes. The only plan that we have is the one that was prepared by Michael Porter in the 2007 or 2006. And, Libya at that time, it's not Libya today. So in terms of resources, stability, and everything. So I think we really need to have a plan, a realistic one, to start with it. Because whenever and I'm involved in so many of the economic dialogue, and I'm a member of the economic dialogue. And, you know, everybody wants to do everything, and it's just not realistic, you know. And I think, yes, so I think the start should be the plan, and yes, and then we can do much.
Okay, thank you very much, Hala. Emad, there's a couple of questions about, one about CBMs. What CBMs, what are the confidence building measures that are being pursued to actively bolster the ceasefire? And then a question about the ceasefire monitoring team, which has just arrived in Libya, to implement key elements of the, I don't think they're there to implement key elements of the ceasefire agreement, they're there to monitor it. But what response do you think the Security Council should take or give to ensure greater implementation of the ceasefire? And in fact, that question then asks me what the UK should do about it. So maybe, Emad, you take your part first, and then I'll answer the last part of that question.
Yeah, in terms of the confidence building measures that are implemented as part of the ceasefire, that were envisioned as part of the ceasefire, you have to bear in mind that there are almost two components to this ceasefire. There's a micro component, which is about the demilitarization of Sirte itself, and then there's a macro kind of side of things, which is about the return of foreign mercenaries, the vacation of air bases, military bases, etc. Neither of which have really been made any headway on. That's why I mentioned that a lot of it is not contingent upon, or not incumbent upon, Libyans. What was made headway on to an extent by the 5+5 is in terms of exchange of prisoners, first of all, between the two sides, exchange of bodily remains in certain cases as well, for proper burials, etc. And there were partly mechanisms that were deliberated on but not implemented on joint security being deployed to Sirte itself by the respective ministries of interior in terms of military police, and setting up a joint military or police apparatus that would actually implement security in Sirte itself. And the other component of that is this monitoring aspect of things. So, and this is where the team that is involved is actually supposed to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire. Unfortunately, the joint policing side of things was not implemented. Oh, and the last also confidence building measure was demining, which has been made, there was headway on, but the extent of mining that has occurred makes it very difficult for the impact to be felt, really. And that's part of the reason why the coastal road hasn't been opened. And that's part of the reason why the MPs flew to Sirte. There were, the fact that this, I think that's why I said the two issues cannot be compartmentalized. The political and the security cannot be compartmentalized. The issue of holding the endorsement session in Sirte made the issue of foreign mercenaries leaving and everything become an issue at the fringes of the security track. So the focus became open the coastal road for the political process to unfold, irrespective of really anything else, of the demilitarization of Sirte, of the deployment of a joint policing mechanisms, of all these confidence building measures. So there's a sense of expediency that underpins all the maneuvering, really, and that comes at the expense of making any progress on the demilitarization of Sirte itself. And then from a broader perspective, there's a complete sweeping under the rug of the fact that we have 20K mercenaries, 10 military airbases that are operated jointly or wholly by foreigners, etc. The only factions that are currently leaving Libya, well, I won't say leaving Libya, but are moving from central Libya onto southern Libya are Sudanese mercenaries from the Sudan Liberation Army, Mini Minawi, exclusively due to the fact that the Juba agreement concerns them, and the Juba agreement that was brokered in Sudan in November is a dynamic to look at in addition to Libya. But you have to also take into account that securing footprint in Libya for them is important. And the dependence of local groups, including Haftar's holding of the oil percent, retaining territorial control over air bases in the south and military bases in the south, is contingent upon them being based there. So they derive a lot of funding from being in Libya. And considering that the Juba Agreement does not include some of the biggest factions, including SLA, Abdul Wahid, then it might collapse, and that's when you'll have more mercenaries come into Libya once again. So yeah, even that cosmetic kind of them leaving Libya is sometimes linked to the fact that a ceasefire is being has been brokered in Libya, but that's totally irrespective of it. So yeah, that's hopefully answering the question.
Great, thanks very much, Emad. And that questioner actually asked me what the UK should be doing as penholder. My view is that the UK could be more visible and more actively engaged. And as penholder, I assume that if there is a political outcome out of CERT, there will be a Security Council resolution. And I would like to see that resolution make clear that the only tool in the international community's toolbox that they can use against so-called spoilers would be sanctions. And I know the idea of sanctions against Turkey or the UAE is politically out of the question, but I do think that the threat of sanctions against individuals, I know it hasn't worked in the past against certain Libyan individuals, but I think that reference needs to be made clear in any Security Council resolution. Mary, there's a question. Turkey can be said to have won the war. Can it win the peace? Can it remain the dominant power in Libya? That's from Michelle Cousins.
Well, I would say it's one of a number of powers in Libya right now. I think it's difficult to say which is dominant if there is one single dominant power. What I would say is that Turkey's relationship with Libya goes back quite some time. There were a lot of contracts, particularly in the construction sector during the Gaddafi regime. And post-2011, Turkey has increased its engagement with Libya militarily, as we mentioned, since late 2019. What we've seen happen since the war in Tripoli ended is Turkey very hastily, it has to be said, inserting itself into conversations in Tripoli related to the economic investment, related to security sector reform, related to the energy sector, etc. That has caused some Libyans who were grateful for Turkey's intervention in terms of ending the Tripoli war to basically balk a little bit in that they felt it's too much too soon. So I think that Turkey needs to tread carefully in terms of its engagement. And that's not to mention the fact that in Eastern Libya, there is still very strong anti-Turkey sentiment, particularly amongst those who were still supportive of Khalifa Haftar. That said, there are connections between Turkey and Libya that, say, compared to Russia and Libya, are very strong in terms of people-to-people contacts. Turkey is one of the few countries that Libyans can visit without visas for much of the last 10 years. The business and investment connections between the two and the general people-to-people connections are quite unique in many respects, and that will give Turkey a strong kind of presence in Libya regardless. But Peter, I just want, because I see you have a lot of other questions coming up, and there is a question about the role of women in Libya, which yes. I think, yesterday was International Women's Day. I think it's very important that we mention this, and the fact of the role that women members of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum played during the Dialogue Forum to ensure that there was an agreement of 30% women in the incoming government. Now, unfortunately, it looks as if they're not going to see 30%, but there are a number of women who've been nominated for key positions in the incoming government, including Foreign Minister and Justice Minister. And this is all thanks to the advocacy within the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum by the women members of that dialogue forum, and the advocacy of many Libyan women outside the dialogue forum, including Hala and her colleagues, who have been advocating for a greater role, a greater voice for women in the political process and the wider conversation on Libya for some time. So that's definitely should be part of our conversation.
No, definitely. And I was going to pick up that question also and put it to Hala also about the role of women in the political dialogue and in the future government. There's also a related question, I think, in terms of the role of civil society. What is, because I think civil society has struggled to have its voice heard. I think there are some representatives of civil society at the political dialogue. But I'd be interested, Hala, in your views on the both the roles of women and of civil society for the future of Libya.
So as Mary mentioned, the appointment of ministers is 15%, but we've got an assurance that the government will reach the 30% with the number of deputies. So their commitment will be reached, and this yet will be confirmed with the final appointment. I think women did a great thing. I think UNSMIL really did a good thing, because it wasn't only, they didn't have only women on the peace table, but they also prepared like a recommendation that worked as a charter for everyone that they will need to, it was, a series of consultation with women that it's really a vision of what women really wants in Libya. I think now, I always say representation is not everything, Peter. It's good to have women representative in the cabinet, but that does not really mean that that the government will serve women's interest. And I think the work that women and also civil society should really work on mainstream for the women. They need to mainstream gender in the in all of the government programs like election. We have a low rate of participation of women in the local election, and reconciliation, economic recovery, and so on. And yesterday I was actually with some civil society leaders reading the roadmap, and the commitments is that they will need to provide protection to the human rights defenders and civil society actors, and to work with the civil society. So we were there, somehow there is like an alliance is formed to force whenever we have a government, because until now we don't have, but we want to the government really fulfill the promise to the civil society. So more work to be done by the civil society and women in the future. Yes.
Okay, there was a question which I neglected from earlier. Maybe I can put it to Emad. Is actually a question from the Dutch Libya Cooperation Council. Would doing business with a Dbeibeh government means that they get dirty hands?
Sorry, who would get dirty hands exactly?
Any business people who did business with the Dbeibeh or the Dbeibeh government. It's the link to the bribery accusations, I think.
I mean, until the UNSC puts out its report, etc., I'd rather not personally weigh in on that. I think once that was in, each business entity will do its due diligence about whether it wants to do business in Libya, etc. But yeah.
No, I think it is a difficult question to answer, especially since that government hasn't been approved or even endorsed by Security Council. So I think we've reached 3 o'clock. I just wanted to invite our 3 speakers if they had any last comments that they would like to make in terms of future prospects in Libya. How would they like to see the prospects and the progress over the next couple of months and leading up to December? Let's start with Hala. We'll go around the same for just a couple of minutes, please, quickly on your predictions for the future.
It's very difficult to really conclude this in 1 minute. I think it's a bumpy road, so much to do, and I don't think it will be, even if we had the vote of confidence today or tomorrow, I don't think it will be an easy ride for the new government. So much to be done, and so many actors should. I think one comment is that we usually in Libya blaming the international actors on the mess that we have, but what we have now show that we have our internal spoilers that we need to deal with. And I think this is yet another challenge for Libya. So in that, I will conclude.
Okay, thank you, Emad. Last thoughts?
Yeah, I'll be very quick about it. I think we are sometimes, and this is something that we've seen with regards to Haftar. This is the same impetus kind of drives those questions about Saif, about the prince, etc., and even the Dbeibeh government. Actually, we sometimes long for this idea of normalcy based on a blueprint from the past. Basically, this idea that everything can be straitjacketed back into normalcy because we view that, for instance, Bugaighis is very much viewed as a relic of the old system that can bring the system back together. That's how he's approached actually the formation of his government, recreate these patronage networks across the country. I don't think that system is going to be sustainable. I think there should be a push. If the international community should focus on anything, it's for pushing the government to conduct reforms, necessary reforms. I don't think the timeline for those reforms is realistic given the timeline that this government has. So if anything, the push should be to actually make it abide by the date of the 24th of December elections, just so we can then be able to hold the new government accountable, actually, because this one clearly won't be from my perspective. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And Mary?
Well, I think we've seen a kind of a leveling of the conflict landscape, so to speak, over the since June of last year. We've seen a lot of clear signs of war fatigue on the part of the Libyan belligerents, but also the wider population, including the support bases of the belligerents. So in many ways, we can say that, you know, there does seem at this point, given what we're seeing happening with the UN dialogue process, the momentum of that, even if there are challenges ahead in terms of the incoming government, it is true that there looks to be a window, a positive window right now that we haven't seen in Libya for quite some time. That said, I think it's good to be cautiously optimistic, with the emphasis on cautiously, because we have been here before several times since 2014, when Libya last had its elections, etc., and another UN dialogue started within a few months of that. So I think that in some quarters there is an optimism that maybe is a little bit too positive. There are real and significant challenges ahead, not just in terms of this incoming government and its mandate and what it may achieve or not before December, whether we're going to see elections happen in December or not. And then, of course, the question of how all the spoilers, both internal and external, may respond to developments in the next months. So I think cautious optimism, with the emphasis on cautious, and an awareness of the very real and significant challenges yet ahead.
Thank you, Mary. I think that's a really good note to finish on, that cautious optimism, which I'll take away with me as well. So on my behalf, thank you to the three speakers for being so clear and lucid in their presentations and for answering the questions. And my apologies to anybody whose questions I didn't manage to pick up or reach. And with that, back to Chris.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much to all our speakers today, to Mary, Hala, and Emad. I'm really, it's great to hear what Mary said there, that we can permit ourselves a degree of cautious optimism. All too often dealing with the Middle East, we can talk about confident pessimism regarding countries like Syria or Yemen. So it's nice to be able to sort of think in terms of a political process and something going forward, hopefully, and all power to the likes of Hala and everything that they do in terms of promoting civil society and women's role and so forth. But thank you all for speaking, as Peter said, so lucidly over a wide range of topics. Thank you to all our participants for your great questions. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. We have one on Thursday. I've just posted that on the chat. And for those who aren't members, please do join up to Caabu. We'd love to have you. Have your support, and we'll certainly be doing more events on Libya in the future. Thank you very much, everyone.